Oh, some of those guys you just saw in that Sunday Spotlight from Week 11 were featured in last week's Stardom and Sit-em. It's time for Week 12 with Michael F. Florio. Go to NFL.com/startsit to see the full list. Mike, let's start as we customarily do with the quarterbacks. Who is going into your lineup?
I'm not going to be the only one that says that this week. You watch the Ravens every week. As good as their passing attack are, their secondary, not so much, which is why you play the quarterback who's facing the Ravens. And this week, it is Justin Herbert, who's been playing a lot better himself. 22 fantasy points per game in his last 4, multiple passing touchdowns in 3 of those. But what stands out to me is he's running even more. Over 30 rushing yards in 3 of his last 4. Last week had a season-high 65 rushing yards. 2 weeks ago had a rushing touchdown. But again, Ravens, most passing yards, second most passing touchdowns, third most fantasy points per game, 2 quarterbacks. And their offense scores plenty, so this could be a score fest. You want to start Justin Herbert this week. He's not the only quarterback in that division you want to start. Bo Nix. Since week 5, 21.5 fantasy points per game. You see there, that is top 5 quarterback production, even though he's still on waivers in some leagues. I don't get it. In that span, though, since week 5, 1 game with fewer than 16 fantasy points, 2 over 28. So he brings a safe floor, and there's clearly upside there. We know he runs, but he's been getting better results as a passer with multiple touchdowns in 5 of his last 7. Raiders, 8th most fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and they're not a defense to be afraid of. Start Bo Nix with confidence this week.
Oh, yeah. The Bo Leavers, all of us here on NFL Fantasy Live, stealing that from Marcus, who said it earlier today in the meeting. So 6 teams on a bye. We'll say it one more time. How do we sit somebody who scored 20-plus points last week, Mike?
Yeah, it's not a must-sit, I guess I would say, because of the buys. But if you get away from Sam Darnold in this one, I would try. Last week, look, that rushing touchdown propped up his day. I thought it came after a questionable penalty, but I'll take the L anyway for saying to sit him. Not going to stop me from doing it again because of the matchup. The Bears have allowed a league-low 7 passing touchdowns all season long. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Darnold has 7 turnovers in his last 3. And as we have seen in recent weeks, some of these divisional matchups can be defensive battles and be a little bit more uglier football than we are accustomed to. So if you have another option you feel comfortable about, like any of the guys I just said to start, I would start them over Sam Darnold.
All right, so Sam Darnold going onto the bench if you have the options. Let's go back to the start side in the running backs. Who's getting in?
I built my strategy this year off of Isaiah Pacheco, and he is nowhere to be found until now. If Isaiah Pacheco plays this week, I think both he and Kareem Hunt are in play. We know how good Pacheco is. Hunt has averaged 16 fantasy points per game in his last 6 weeks. I'm guessing we see a split here, but the matchup is so good. They are top 2 in rushing yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. I believe this will be a game where the Chiefs have a lead, probably a comfortable lead in the second half, so they can run out the clock. Enough volume there to make both of those guys in play as RB2s. And then I love Tyrone Tracy Jr. every week, but especially this week. He's averaged 19 opportunities per game in his last 6. In 4 of those, he topped 14 fantasy points. Twice, he's topped 22, so we know there's upside there. And Tommy DeVito could be a good thing for him because he threw to running backs 20% of the time last year compared to 15% for Daniel Jones this year. The Bucs struggle against pass-catching backs, and in general, they're in the top 5 in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks.
Okay, so good on Tyrone Tracy. Again, we're looking forward to this cut. Let's start the first one in 2024. But who goes on our bench for running backs?
A big name, at least fantasy production-wise. I think Chuba Hubbard can hit the bench this week, and it's all about the matchup. Like, Chuba Hubbard has been awesome for fantasy purposes. He's getting the job done. But the Chiefs have allowed the fewest rushing yards and fantasy points per game to running backs. They have held Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, J.K. Dobbins, Alvin Kamara, James Cook, Jordan Mason, and the Bucs running backs all to under 50 rushing yards. That is a who's who of like big name running backs that they have shut down. And then on top of it all, Jonathan Brooks is there. It could take more work. Could be a potential blowout one way for the Chiefs. So I would try to avoid Chuba in this one if possible.
Yeah, a rough one for the Panthers. You almost would have preferred the Chiefs still be unbeaten for this one. But there's players people are sleeping on, Marcus. Let's wake them up.
Let's absolutely wake up some folks with some Week 12 sleepers. We got quarterbacks and running backs that we are looking into. And let's start with the Kansas City Chiefs because the 2024 version of Patrick Mahomes has pretty much been a matchup-based starter. But I'll tell you what, this week, he's got the matchup in his favor, going against the Carolina Panthers, who have been a top 7 best matchup for quarterbacks this season. Hey, don't look now. But this could be the start of a run for Mahomes. Going back to week 8, he is the QB8. He's got a healthy Juju Smith-Schuster. They've added DeAndre Hopkins. Isaiah Pacheco could be back as soon as this week. The rest of the season, he has either neutral or positive matchups. So for all of our frustrations with Mahomes, look, it may not be peak Patrick Mahomes for fantasy, but he could still be a top 10 fantasy quarterback through the rest of the playoffs. Another sleeper for this week. Okay, Brian Robinson maybe is stretching the definition of sleeper a little bit, but with 6 teams on a bye, it's hard to find a lot of guys who legitimately qualify. Plus, it's hard to find a lot of guys who get to face the Dallas Cowboys this week. They are the 4th best matchup for running backs this season, giving up a league-high 18 rushing touchdowns. Meanwhile, you have Jaden Daniels in a little bit of a mini slump. He has not been quite as electric as he was early in the season. Maybe we get a little bit more of the Commanders establishing the run. Teams running it a lot and running it successfully against the Cowboys. Brian Robinson looks like he is next in line for that honor. And finally, Tua Tagovailoa. I know we keep saying that the Dolphins passing game has been sort of meh this year, but Tua threw 3 touchdown passes last week. The first time he's done that since week 8 of last year when he faced the New England Patriots in Miami. Guess what? This week, he faces the New England Patriots in Miami. This is a Pats defense over the last couple of weeks that gave up 4 touchdown passes to Matthew Stafford. A couple weeks prior to that, gave up a pair of touchdown passes to Mason Rudolph. So maybe, just maybe, this is a situation where Tua and the Dolphins can get a little bit healthy at the expense of New England. Coming up next on NFL Fantasy Live, time to bring back an old favorite. We are going to flex or forget about it with Tommy Cutlets back under center for the New York Giants. Plus, we have some guys that we should tell you whether or not they'll be in your flex spot. Stick around for that after the break.
Today on NFL Fantasy Live, the wide receivers and tight ends in Stardom Sit 'em. Again, go to NFL.com/startsits for the full list. Let's start with the wide receivers here, Mike. Who's going in our lineup?
What kind of person would I be if I wore a Malik Neighbors shirt and then was like, sit Malik Neighbors? Although I think I did that with Anthony Richardson earlier this season. But yeah, start Malik Neighbors, no questions asked. A lot of you have been tweeting me and stuff like, what does the move to Tommy DeVito mean for Neighbors? I actually think it could be a good thing because their numbers are pretty similar, Cutlets from last year and Danny Dimes, but Cutlets was much more effective on deep passes, so that could help elevate Malik Neighbors fantasy-wise. I still expect a bunch of volume to go his way, and it is a great matchup. Bucks 6th most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and it could be a game where the Giants are chasing points. And then I keep saying it, you want to start people against the Ravens defense. That includes both of their top 2 wide receivers, Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnston. Both last week had a 32% first read rate, tied for the team lead. Told you earlier that I like Quentin Johnston. I like McConkey even more this week. Sees consistent volume, coming off of a career best day, and the Ravens have been torched by wide receivers all year. So in what could be a high-scoring game, expect Justin Herbert to air it out even more than he usually does.
Yeah, all on that game. Looking forward to that one again on Monday night, my birthday. Actually, let's go over to who's sitting at wide receiver.
The Ravens better win for you on your birthday. Otherwise, we're going to be pretty upset on this show. I'm going to sit Jalen Waddle this week because just like what I said with C.J. Stroud earlier in the show, Waddle is just a name right now. There is simply no fantasy production. Single digits in every single game since week 2. 3 targets or fewer in 3 of his last 5 games. I know he's a big name. I know this is a good matchup. He's had good matchups before in this run and not really come through. Eventually, he'll have a big game. Good luck figuring it out when. Until we see signs of life, I think you just put him on the bench with Jalen Waddle right now.
Yeah, it's tough, especially on an offense that we all really believed in. Such a good player. Glad to get Tua back. It's not working out. Let's go back to the good side on the starts at the tight end spot. Who is it?
Hunter Henry, who is the go-to guy for Drake May in this Patriots offense right now. Since Drake May took over, Henry is averaging 11.2 fantasy points per game, and he has a 26% first read rate, which is the 6th best amongst tight ends. Plus, Miami has allowed the 4th most yards to tight ends since week 7, so they could be chasing points because the Dolphins are going to put up plenty this week, I think. I like Hunter Henry a lot. And sticking on brand this week, give me Will Dissly against the Ravens. Since week 7, Dissly has averaged 6.6 targets and 10.8 fantasy points per game. Very useful numbers. He also has the 8th highest first read rate amongst tight ends in that span. And the Ravens, second most yards, ninth most fantasy points per game allowed to tight ends. Really good streaming option in a week that I know a lot of you are in need of tight end streamers with 6 teams on bye.
Especially considering Roquan Smith didn't finish last week and Kyle Hamilton finished the game hopping on one leg. To pay attention to Will Dissly there. It's been hard at tight end. You've got a quality tight end that's going on the bench this week, Mike.
I started this guy last week, and it was like he was on bye then. I mean, 1 target, 0 fantasy points for Tucker Kraft last week. And this wasn't like it was a 1-week blip in the radar. The 0 fantasy points was. But in his last 5 games, just 3.6 targets per game. He is shown to be very big play or touchdown reliant, which is better than a lot of tight ends. I get that if you can't get away because the 6 teams on bye. I understand, but it's also a really tough matchup. 49ers, 4th fewest yards to tight ends on the season, 2nd fewest since week 7, and you see there 1 top 10 fantasy allowed. So if you have another option or another streamer, something like Will Dissly, Hunter Henry, I would go with them over Tucker Kraft this week.
All right, well, what about a tight end sleeper? Not just that, another sleeper as well. Marcus Grant, who are they?
Oh, we're looking at some pass-catching sleepers for Week 12. Let's start down in the desert with Marvin Harrison Jr. He wasn't supposed to be a sleeper this year. He was just supposed to explode. It hasn't quite happened for MHJ, but maybe this week against the Seahawks, he can make it happen. He's very consistently targeted on about a quarter of his routes, actually leads the team with 6 receiving touchdowns, going against a Seattle defense that's giving up the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers over the last month. They've also allowed 3 top 10 wide receivers in the last 2 games. The Cardinal passing game has been a lot lower volume than we anticipated, but maybe this is a week that Harrison finally is able to get unlocked. Then we go over to New York, where Theo Johnson was kind of a deep sleeper coming into the season. Look, the switch to Tommy DeVito could actually work in his favor. Last year, Tommy Cutlets was a little bit of a check down king. That's what helped Wan'Dale Robinson thrive in that offense. We know that Johnson's not really a downfield threat, likes to work underneath in the middle of the field. That could actually mean he gets a lot of targets, especially against a Tampa Bay defense or Tampa Bay offense that's going to throw the ball a lot, score a lot of points, and maybe force the Giants to stay up with it in a score fest potentially this week. And finally, we go with Rome Odunze with the Chicago Bears. For as much as the Bears passing game has kind of frustrated us, there are things we like about it. It's fairly narrowly funneled. It's between Odunze, Keenan Allen, and DJ Moore. They're getting all the opportunities, really, over the last 3 games. Odunze leads the Bears with 192 receiving yards. Going against a Vikings offense that is getting gashed on deep balls. They have the 4th most explosive plays allowed this season. So maybe we see Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze doing their thing downfield. Coming up after the break, we are calling our shots. Yeah, you want to be a baller, shot caller, 20 fantasy points in your Impala. We're going to find some guys we think are going to go big this week and tell you all about them. Stick around to find out who.
Highway.